Good afternoon, everybody. Today we're going to talk a little bit about point of view, which will be another one of our elements of fiction that will add to the terms that you can use when you're analyzing literature. Let's start with the basic definition. Point of view is simply the imaginary relation between the narrator and the characters and the events created by the narrative. And point of view is important because it will frame the worldview of the story and shape how we view the events of the story and help us out as readers if we think more about point of view. Also, when you guys go to write your own narratives at the end of this unit, the end of the quarter, you'll really want to give some time to thinking about what point of view would be best for the story that you want to tell. One important point about the narrator is the fact that the narrator is not the same as the author. You don't want to conflate those two, just like the speaker in the poem isn't the same as the poet, him or herself. So don't assume that because you know certain things about Edgar Allan Poe or whoever you're reading, that that's who is speaking in the story. One thing that you also need to do with your narrator is not necessarily trust what he or she is telling you. A lot of times we take what they're saying at face value and we believe it to be true. We'll take a look at a Poe story tomorrow night where we aren't quite sure if the narrator is telling us the truth or not. So trust is a big issue. You have to ask if you can trust your narrator or not. If you cannot, they are called an unreliable narrator. And that's something that has started to appear in more modern fiction. And you'll see it a little bit if you read The Catcher in the Rye, your sophomore or junior year. Holden Caulfield is a bit of an unreliable narrator. And sometimes horror stories or scary stories will use unreliable narrators, especially if that narrator is someone who has committed a crime. There are two basic types of narrators that are most common. There are actually three, but we'll just focus on the ones that are most common. The first is the third-person narrator, and that person is a non-participant in the story. They are distanced from the events of the story. A couple different types of third-person narrators. One of the most common is an omniscient narrator. Omni comes from all, and so omniscient means that they are all-knowing. They're sort of godlike because they can see what everyone's thinking and what everyone's doing. Then there's limited omniscient, which is also fairly common, and that's where you see inside the mind of one or two characters, but not the whole cast of the entire story or novel. The final kind is a little more rare, an objective third-person narrator that's outside of all of the characters, that cannot read their minds or let us know anything about their thoughts. That's not very common because one of the points of having a third-person narrator is being able to enter into the mind of a bunch of different characters. Okay, so that leads us to this question of why using a third-person narrator. We saw in the Scarlet Ibis today that there's a first-person narrator, which seems a little bit odd if you think about it, because that person, he's revealing lots of unflattering things about himself and how he felt about his brother. It would make more sense for that to be told using a third-person narrator. Typically, the third-person narrator seems to be a little more believable because they are perhaps unbiased or less connected to the events. It just provides multiple points of view for the readers. The next most common type of narrator is the first-person narrator, and that person is an actual participant in the story. The major character or the protagonist is often your narrator, but not always. Sometimes authors will choose to make a minor character the first-person narrator. An example of this is The Great Gatsby. It's narrated by a guy named Nick Carraway, and who comes to tell us about Gatsby. And that makes sense in that story because, not to give anything away if you haven't seen the movie or read the book, but Gatsby dies at the end. And so Nick survives and is able to tell his story. One nice thing about a first-person narrator typically is that you know they're going to live. So during those maybe more tense moments of the climax, or if you fear for their safety, they're still telling the story, so you can kind of be assured that they'll make it. First-person narrators are nice for a few different reasons. They can personalize the story. They make you feel more connected. And that also makes them a little more believable. I talked about how the third-person narrator can be believable because they are more distant and perhaps unbiased. The first-person narrator you can sympathize with more. You feel like they're talking personally to you. But this makes you need to also be aware that there are often many unreliable first-person narrators, okay? If you think about when you tell a version of a story, typically you tell the version of the story that's going to make you look good. And so the first-person narrator, you sometimes need to be a little skeptical. Thank you very much, guys. We've reached the end of our point of view notes. This should have been just a review of terms, but the terms themselves aren't as important as being able to think deeply about why the author chose that and how it shapes the meaning and feel of the story. One way of doing that is thinking, how would this story feel different if it were told from a different point of view? And whose point of view is left out of the story? So those are some things that we will explore tomorrow. Thank you. Have a good night.